Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we're jumping all over the timeline these last few weeks. We're going back to Operation Dragoon today and the important and often overlooked contribution of French forces in the liberation of the south of France and then moving up towards Germany. Antoine is a historian, a war gamer, and a serving army officer. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Antoine. How are you today?
I'm fine, Paul. How about you?
I'm good. So we got this conversation started even before we went live because this is of many unsung stories of World War II. The French forces in the south of France, maybe not unsung, but it's just overshadowed via the 2nd French Armored Division coming ashore in Normandy and liberating Paris and General Leclerc. And it seems to be the route that gets the focus, it gets the attention, it gets the books. But this campaign, incredibly important in not only in terms of 1944 and 1945, but how France is dealing with itself as an empire and how it's dealing with its regions and people from different areas. So it's about time we talked about it, really. I assume you agree.
I do. Absolutely. So yeah, I think it's really important to talk about Operation Dragoon. And there is something I had to actually dig when I was preparing actually the last show and the last moment when we met the first time when we met on YouTube, Paul. And what I thought, I was looking for war games about this period. And it should come as no surprise that you will find almost something like 500 war games on Normandy. So being from the beaches for or just fighting for the beaches or tactical stuff or just for the whole campaign till Falaise Pocket. And there's only something like 10 or 5 to 10 war games about Operation Dragoon. So in fact, it's not only the French participation actually that got a very low record by the historians, by usually the public, but it's really the norm actually. So it's not really considered important for many reasons. First, as you remember, as you know, Dragoon was to be called Anvil in the beginning, and it was to be accompanied with another operation who was to be called Sledgehammer. And who was supposed to take part exactly on the same day, so in early June. But the problem was there were not sufficient boats and sufficient landing craft for doing the two operations simultaneously. So the Operation Dragoon had to be postponed and only took place around the 15th of August. So the thing is, which is important in this situation, is the participation of the French forces, because it's a huge army actually, but it's also an army that actually did not participated into the landing itself. It arrived on the next day, and for many reasons that I'm going to explore in a minute. But before that, I think the important thing would be to start with the Free French, because actually the troops that are landing during Operation Dragoon are troops that are a mixed bag of ex-Free French forces and ex-Vichy forces. So for 1940 to 1942, actually, there were the only French fighting during World War II were the Free French from the General de Gaulle. De Gaulle, at this moment, is a rebel. He has been submitted to death. He has been condemned to death by the Vichy regime, and so he is in a difficult position, and he has only very few troops. He's mainly located in London. He has troops also that are fighting in Africa, in northern Africa, with the 8th Army. Some troops were also deployed, and we are going to talk about this in a minute, in Syria with the British Army, fighting the Vichy regime forces. Everybody thought that it would be an easy part, and that perhaps the Vichy troops in Syria would not really put up a serious fight, but actually they did. So it was a bit of a disappointment. And so there were lots of resentment between the French Vichy regime that basically remained loyal to Marshal Pétain, who was actually at the time collaborating with the German occupiers and Hitler, and the French forces. But everything, of course, changed with Operation Torch. So in November 1942, the Americans and the British made landing in French North Africa. What you see here is a picture of a French soldier that is captured after fighting by American soldiers, and so there were lots of fightings. Actually, again, many people thought that the Vichy regime would not keep up fighting against the invaders, but this is absolutely not what happened. So there were lots of fightings during a few days, actually. After a while, it stopped, and then most of the French army of North Africa basically came to be on the side of the Allies, but not specifically on the side of de Gaulle, because there were lots of actually fightings for inside the fighting French, as some people called them at the time, between who was going to be the leader of this. So some people, the Americans, were not really keen on de Gaulle. They consider him as a pain in the ass, which it certainly was, because basically, as he said, the only thing I have left is principles. So don't ask me to renounce to my principles, because this is the only thing I have, actually. And he was right. So they favored another solution, which was General Giraud, who was more Pétainist and was also considered to be more easy to handle, to be honest. But Giraud didn't have the right stuff actually to be a leader, and so de Gaulle carried on and managed basically to remain in place and took more and more importance inside it. But so what happened at the time is that the French army had to merge, actually, there was a merge between the French forces and the Vichy forces in Northern Africa. It was not an easy task. There were lots of resentment. There were resentment, as I mentioned. I go to the Italian campaign just after that. There were lots of resentment for instance, what happened in Syria, where Free French fought alongside the British against Vichy French in Syria. There were also resentment for what had just happened during the Operation Torch in November 1942. And also, the Free French were a bit disgusted, actually, for some of them, to realize that some will have to serve under the orders of officers that basically did nothing during two years, just wait to see what would happen, actually. So lots of generals from this new French army were actually ex-cadres from the Vichy regime, from the Vichy army, not Vichy regime, but Vichy army. And so there were lots of resentment. Just to tell you how it is, you had an armor regiment, which was called the 12th Cuirassier. And so you may know that in the old French army, just like in the British army, you have royal regiments, for instance. And so when some Free French officers learned that this regiment that has been remaining in Northern Africa for 2 years were to join them, they nicknamed it the Royal Nazi. So you see, it was really, really, really not easy situation. But in the end, the French army managed to create a new army. So, which is important in this matter is we are going to talk about training and going to talk about equipment. Training, interestingly, there was absolutely no British or American instructors. The French army actually took his books from the 30s and the infantry books, the infantry manual, and just took it back and used it with obviously better results than in 1940. But obviously, nothing really changed in this regard. But for the material and uniforms and stuff, most of the material were coming from American stocks, some of British stocks. So you have all these units that have a very strange looking uniforms, usually with a cascadrion, the French classical helmet from the First and Second World War, and some basically some American outfits, sometimes with British equipment and stuff. So it makes for really interesting. If you are into miniatures, if you want to paint miniatures, it's a really interesting army actually to paint. So this army actually, its first baptism of fire was the campaign of Tunisia, and after that, the campaign of Italy. I see that Rob Crane is asking me roughly what was the approximate balance between French nationals and colonial troops. That's a very interesting question, Rob. Thank you for asking. In Operation Dragoon, clearly the colonial was something like perhaps 70% of the troops. But you have also to understand that when we say colonial in this moment, we have, of course, troops coming from Northern Africa. So they are coming from Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. Some of them are from European descent and still serving in this kind of regiments. So you see it's beginning to be more complicated. And you also have the colloquial tirailleurs sénégalais, who actually don't only come from Senegal, but usually come from all the part of South Sahel Africa. So they come from Mali, they come from Senegal, they come from Chad, they come from all the French African colony. So so it's a bit difficult to actually state, because as you see, some colonial troops in a sense are in fact people coming. You have people from European descent, and sometimes you also have European officers coming into kind of units. So it's a mixed bag actually. But for the three units that we are going to study today, 3 divisions, there is a huge proportion of colonial troops indeed. So the real test actually was the Italian campaign. So at the time there was what we call the CEFI, the Corps Expéditionnaire Français in Italy, the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy, and there were basically at the beginning 3 divisions. The first, which is the 3rd Algerian Infantry Division. The second are 2 Moroccan divisions, the 2nd Moroccan Division, Infantry Division, and the 4th Moroccan Mountain Infantry Division. And so these units actually fought hard around Cassino, taking huge losses in the process. I know, and you probably know, that I've been to Cassino many times. I was lucky to do that and go on visits and tours on Cassino with the French army. And as you know, everybody's kind of saying that his army is the one who liberated Cassino. So you have the Poles, and you have the British, and you have the Americans, and of course the French. Everybody says that they were the first inside the abbey of Cassino. So I think it was the Poles anyway. But
I agree. I think if the Poles, they can't deserve it, but everybody's involved. The New Zealanders, the French, the British, Americans. It's a truly international battle.
Absolutely, it's amazing. It's an amazing battle for that. And so it was the first test actually for the French army at the time, and it was also a test because there were lots of people who were rather dubious about what are the French going to do. They've been badly beaten in 1940. Some, if not most of them, choose not to take part into the war from 1940 to 1942. So lots of people. So it raised our eyebrows, obviously, and for good reasons. But the French really showed that they were good fighters, and specifically good fighters in the mountains, because most of the, as you may or you may not know, that actually most of North Africa has lots of mountains, the Atlas chain of mountains. So lots of people coming from North Africa actually have lots of are quite at ease when they are going to fight into the mountains. So this is the reason why you had a Moroccan mountain division, to the 4th Moroccan mountain division, and so these people took part into the Italian campaign. But after that, they also took part in 1943 in the liberation of Corsica and the island of Elba. So Corsica actually is the first so-called metropolitan part of France that has been liberated in 1943. With British troops, American troops, met mostly by French troops. And what you see here is a maquisard, a Corsican resistant, which is rather funny today because, you know, there are lots of nationalists in Corsica and use exactly the same stuff that you see here, which is what we call la tête de mort, which is the symbol of Corsica. And you have the symbol of Corsica and the word France written on it. And you see also that he's obviously carrying a stand from British origins. So Corsica was liberated. The island of Elba was also liberated by French troops, which is funny because you may remember that Elba actually was the first island where Napoleon was put in exile in 1814 before he was sent to Saint Helene, because obviously Elba was not sufficiently far away from the coasts of France for him to come back. So there were lots of sort of fightings, but we are coming now to Dragoon, and I wanted to also to show you this map because it's interesting, because it shows all the origins and where all the forces taking part into the Operation Dragoon started from. And so you see lots of troops who are coming also from Corsica, some from the south of Italy, some from North Africa, and so the thing is. Sardinia was. I don't remember. I think the British liberated. Trevor is asking who liberated next door Sardinia, and I think it's the British and the Americans that did that. But I'm not too sure. I would have to check. So, yeah. So the French were mostly equipped with US kits, as Peter just mentioned, also in the comments. Yep. And so what happened is that the operation, the amphibious operation, was almost purely an American operation. And there has been lots of debates around this for obvious reasons. Some people, for instance, not in France, said that the main reason was that they had no confidence into the efficiency of the French troops that were going to land, which is obviously not true because, as I mentioned earlier, these people had already fought in Italy, and so they were experienced. But there was an experience that it definitely lacked, which was experience of amphibious landing. So this is why the Americans actually landed first and the French followed. So during this operation, the French Navy also took its part. And I think it's really important to mention it because there were more than 20 destroyers, 6 cruisers, and also an old battleship that took part into the operation, bombarding the coast and the German defenders. Which is actually a more important participation than the French participation during D-Day on a naval term. And I wanted to mention the French Navy because even during Overlord, actually, lots of people tend to concentrate on what happened on the beaches, but tend to forget that there were many thousands of sailors from Britain, from the US, from France, from Norway, from lots of countries that actually also took part in the fighting and were really helpful for the troops that landed on this fateful day. So the French, what you see here on the front is the cruiser Georges Legge, who participated in the bombardment of the coast during the Operation Anvil. So there were 3 divisions to take Marseille and Toulon. What you see here actually are medical personnel, and because there were lots of French women actually inside this French army, also in the 2nd Armored Division, but there were also lots of French personnel, women personnel, in this French army. So there are 3 divisions actually that followed up on the 16th of August. The first, we already mentioned it, was the 3e Division d'Infanterie Algérienne, so the 3rd Algerian Infantry Division that already took part into fightings, as I mentioned, in Italy. The second was the old DFL, Division Française Libre, who was renamed DMI, who was basically, so the Algerian division obviously was mainly composed of people coming from Algeria. So you had what we called at the time Muslim Algerians, and we had also Europeans. So, but the Muslims were the most numerous, obviously, into the regiments. The French and the Europeans were mainly concentrated, for instance, in the artillery units. So you also had the DFL, which is also called the DMI. So DFL for first Free French Division, Première Division Française Libre, who at the time has it been totally reformed and was mainly incorporating soldiers coming from Africa. So they were mainly tirailleurs sénégalais, sorry. So black Africans fighting into this unit. And the third was also they were French and Africans. Sorry, the third was the 9th Division d'Infanterie Coloniale, Colonial Infantry Division, which was also composed mainly of people coming from the Sahel, so from Mali, from Chad, from all the French colonies of West and Central Africa. So all these people actually did a great job into mopping up the stuff on the coast, because you have to remember that the main interest for the Allies when they wanted to land on this part of the France was to take Toulon and Marseille, were two huge ports, and that would help alleviate the burden of Cherbourg and all the ports on the Atlantic and in Normandy that were absolutely outstretched for many logistical reasons. And so it was considered as a good idea to have another axis of logistics from the Rhone Valley up to the Rhine. So perhaps I should stop a bit and answer a few questions at this time. So,
we've got a few questions that are building up. So when we're talking about all these different countries, because France's empire, like Britain's empire, there are different classifications of metropolitan France and their colonies, and it's still different today because France spreads the most time zones of any country in the world, even today in 2024, because of counting country part of itself. I forget which ones are still counted as metropolitan France, even though they're not in France. Whereas in the British Empire, we talk about the Commonwealth, we talk about the empire. So when you're talking about troops from Senegal, from Mali, are they serving as French citizens? Are they serving as citizens from their own countries? Are they volunteers? Are they drafted? Or does it change from country to country and area to area?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, they are not French citizens at all. They are people coming from the colonies. The Algeria being the exception, because Algeria actually, France is in France you have what we call the departments, which are basically huge counties. So and Algeria actually has 3 departments, so is considered somehow as a part of France. So the same thing as it would be for Brittany or Corsica, whoever. The other are colonials, so the status is different. They are not considered as French citizens. They don't have the right to vote, for instance. And their countries are, well, not really countries. They are colonies at the time. They're not countries. But there is also a problem, which is not really a problem, actually, but was during the period from 1940 to 1942, which is there was one of the main goals for the Free French was to be able to take hold of the French colonies because they were still considered, they were still in the hand of the Vichy regime. And so it was really important for de Gaulle to have lots of governors from these colonies to say, okay, I am leaving Vichy regime and occupied France, and I am rejoining the Free French. And so this is why, actually, and this is how all this manpower came into North Africa, because there were lots of people that were coming from these colonies. They were volunteers, but they were clearly not the majority. Most of the people were actually drafted. and so they had really no choice to fight for the fatherland. Quote, but which was clearly not the fatherland, but which also raised a few other issues, and I'm going to talk about this, what we call the whitewashing of the French army in the later stage of this presentation. But so what we have to understand is that there were absolutely no problem for the French army, for instance, during the First World War, to have units with Africans, Northern Africans, fighting on the front, which was clearly not the case for the Americans, for instance. But we're going to examine this in a moment. So these people actually were second zone citizens, if you may consider them. They were They were French soldiers by no doubt, but they were still considered as members of a colony. So they were colonials, and didn't have the same status as the metropolitan French, which is clearly which was to become an issue afterwards, because of course when these people came back to what would become eventually their own countries with their independence, some people would say, okay, we fought for France. Actually, we liberated you, and what have you done for us? Nothing. Well, not that much. So you had lots of problems, for instance, with pensions. The people from the colony didn't get the same money as veterans as the people coming from the metropole. So it was also, there was lots of resentment afterwards. But so, is there any other question?
We've got plenty of questions. I mean, and that what you said about the French and pensions, that same thing applies to British. I mean, Gurkhas only getting the right to settle in Britain in recent years, and they've had problems for generations with pensions and rights, and that extends to tributes from India and then what became Pakistan after the war. So this isn't a problem that's unique to France and its colonies. It was a British problem. This is the interesting thing, that in 1944. Your main players, your Churchills and your, I guess, Leclercs and de Gaulles, they're also thinking about a post-war situation, as well as they're fighting that immediate war. We talked about the same thing when you talked about Paris. There's the immediate problem of defeating the Third Reich. Then there's this in the background understanding that there's going to be a different world after the war, and colonies will want different things, and the countries will want different. So we're all facing that same problem in 44, 45 of the realization that war will come to an end, but it's going to bring a new set of problems, maybe isn't the right word, but a new set of interests, I suppose.
Yes, things are going to change, and perhaps before we tackle on this subject, just to talk about what happened actually with these French forces. And I can't remember what was the name. Yeah, so basically you have these three divisions. Their mission is to take Marseille and Toulon and to basically do the mop-up. And afterwards, lots of other divisions are going to land in South France. So at the time in Toulon and in Marseille, and go up north in the Rhône Valley, go to fight around Belfort, for instance, and Le Vosges, and so going to the Rhine and Alsace. So all these units came back from here and from what we call the débarquement de Provence. So around this. So these units actually took a huge part in the liberation of southern France. There were also another element of the French army that should not be disregarded, which is the Force Française de l'Intérieur, or FFI. The FFI. So these people were mainly armed and sometimes trained by British, American officers and instructors. You know, all the teams sent by the SOE. You know also the Jetbird that were sent sometimes to give training and weapons and stuff for all the French forces. And so these people also took a huge part into the fighting, because they were able to sneak everywhere. They had lots of information, and they were able to do a lot of recon for the advancing troops. So they were really an asset, actually, not just for the French, actually for all the allies, and both in Normandy and also in the south of southern France. And so there is these people were armed and were trained, and some of them also were to be integrated into the French army in the late 1944. But at the moment, they were mostly an irregular forces supporting the operations by regular forces, and which comes to what I wanted to mention, and this question about what we call the whitewashing of the French army, which is actually a very interesting part of the war. And I have to remind you actually that, in fact, the whitewashing of the French army in the first place was a demand from the U.S. Authorities.
Yeah.
You may remember that at the time there was segregation in the US, and there were not only segregation in the US, but there were also segregation in the US Army. So there were absolutely almost no fighting units of African Americans. You have the Tuskegee pilots, of course. You have a few units of tank destroyers, but for the most part, all the African Americans that were enlisted or drafted inside the American army actually were into logistics for very obvious reasons. First, because they don't want to have white soldiers and black soldiers to mix up, because there was segregation. And second, because what usually happens when you send somebody to war, and especially if you send him to war to fight for liberty and freedom, that when he comes home, is very likely to be asking for rights. That is
his own freedom and liberty. Yeah.
Which is obviously the main reason why actually the Americans were still insisting on having a segregated army, and also insisted from 1942 with the British government actually to enforce segregation, and the British government refused actually to enforce segregation. In Britain. This is also very an untold story, which is very well explored into Peter Caddick-Adams' book about the D-Day. Full chapter on it, and I really should. I think everybody should read it. It's really interesting and eye-opening on this really particular matter. So there was this demand, but of course, this demand was realized by many French officers. Of course, there were racism in the French army, as absolutely everywhere. So there were lots of French officers, were not very it was not for them a great shock to ask them to get rid, so to speak, of African soldiers inside their units. So I insist, it was a demand from the U.S. authorities from the first place, and the French did comply, actually. But you also have to understand another thing, which is actually the whitewashing of the French army is more complicated than you might think, for a very simple reason. The First World War was the first moment where colonial troops were actually deployed in the metropole in France, fighting in the trenches. And so you had people coming from North Africa, from Africa, fighting in the trenches. There were lots of books actually written by some French generals before the war. Mangin, for instance, wrote a book about what he called the Black Force, La Force Noire. And he was a strong advocate of using this huge human material. Sorry to say, this is the way it was was seen at the time for a war. But the thing is, these units, everybody saw that these units during the fall and specifically during the winter had lots of problems, because these people are not from African descent. These people are Africans. So they are living in Africa, with a very different weather and a very different climate than there is in France and obviously in northern France, where it can be freezing cold during the winter. And so usually during the winter months, these units were taken from the front and for 2 or 3 months back, and then they were back on the front line around March or April, when the weather was considered as more,
which is similar, Antoine, to the British, for example, in Burma, trying to avoid monsoon season when it gets too hot. You know, there are peoples who find the European cold difficult, but there are also peoples who found the Southeast Asian climate difficult. So it was one of those things that the Allies had to manage in World War II, is people's sort of inbuilt DNA ability to cope with temperatures and climate. It's a fascinating aspect of World War II, the acclimatization of peoples to different theaters.
Yeah, it reminds me of this fantastic book which is called "The Jungle is Neutral," about the fighting in Burma, by recollections of a British officer, which is against the Japanese in Burma, and which is absolutely outstanding, because you see the jungle is definitely neutral, or the jungle is probably the main enemy for the two armies fighting in this environment. And so all these people were, when you see all the parades in July, and well, not in July, but in August and afterwards in Paris, you see mainly French troops, actually, and you don't see much Africans or Northern Africans during these parades, which is a disgrace.
Yeah.
Because it took a very important part into our liberation, and we should never be thankful enough for that. So, but the whitewashing was, of course, partly due to a part of racism and the volunteer and the will to have another army, to create a new army, but also, as I mentioned, because during usually the fall and the winter of 1944 was pretty cold. Usually these units were not fighting. So you will see them again. You'd see units from Algeria, from Morocco, from Africa, in Germany, actually, from March or around February or March 1945, actually. So they would carry on actually doing the fightings. And but there was also a great issue for the French at the moment, and so which was what we call the amalgam, so which is basically the mix-up between the regulars that we've seen and the irregular forces of the French of the FFI, the French Force Française de l'Intérieur, which basically is something that has been created in the beginning of 1944, just to assemble all the resistance, not movements, but active resistance, fighting Maquis and stuff like that. And so these people needed formation, they needed to have officers, and so basically these people were mixed and put inside other older units, and so there was this mix between the French, the Force Française de l'Intérieur, and the old regulars. And you again had the same problems of assimilations between the two, because in 1942 you had the Free French who were a bit dubious about the idea of fighting with Vichy, with ex-Vichy soldiers, and in 1944 you had these people with the amalgam was almost done, but you had these people who were a bit dubious, had serious doubt about the capabilities and the military capabilities of irregular soldiers that were not really keen on obeying discipline and tactics and so on. But the French army actually was really built not from scratch, but from many parts, dead parts, sometimes living parts, all together to create a new force, which is absolutely, in my view, almost unique, actually, inside during the Second World War, because it's such a mixed bag of so many things, so many units, so many people coming from so many places. Just take, for instance, I'm coming back to the Battle of Bir Hakeim, for instance, in 1942, in the desert. The French division here is absolutely outstanding. So you have two battalions of the 13th Demi Brigade of the French Foreign Legion. So basically, most of these people are Spanish, Italians, and Germans. And you know why they are there, okay? Because they've fled their own countries for obvious reasons. Yeah. You have people coming from the 1st Bataillon du Pacifique. So basically, these people come from New Caledonia. You have people coming from Ubangi-Chari, the 3rd, and there are 3 March battalions from Ubangi-Chari, so they are Africans coming up north. You have a unit of North African machine gunners and stuff. It's incredible, and all the thing, all the thing are commanded by a guy who's never met Saint-Cyr, so he came from the rank and file, and he became a marshal in the end. So this is absolutely incredible, and his chauffeur was English. It was a woman, Susan Travers. So this is an incredible army, actually, and these people were able to resist for 2 weeks against the whole blunt. They were fighting against the whole of the Afrika Korps. So this is an incredible story, actually, not really well known outside France and even in France, actually, to be honest. But,
we did do a show on Bir Hakeim a couple of years ago with Cedric Mass, a French historian. So we have covered it here because we try and get everywhere eventually. So, but it's worth tackling again. And it was just occurring to me when you were saying there about the makeup of this French army in Dragoon is that a lot of them hadn't seen a Nazi. They hadn't seen the Third Reich. They're from colonies that were under the control of the Vichy government, but they haven't actually had Germans walking down their streets. I mean, that's the unusual thing about France's empire extending over such a wide area, is that like Indians joining the British Army or Australians or New Zealanders, that the war hasn't actually come to their home, but it has indirectly.
Well, the thing is, actually, most of these people were liberating a country that as they had never seen before.
Never seen, yeah.
So it's not just about the Germans. It's about most of these people coming from Morocco, from Algeria. France was just a name on the map. That none of them had ever walked into a French street, never took a foot on French soil. So for these people came to liberate a country that actually they didn't know at all, and they did came and died in heaps. So we should be really thankful for them to do that, actually.
Yeah. No, definitely. Well, we'll do a few more questions if you don't mind, because you've got plenty coming up. Oh, I'm going to put you on the screen as well. So, how well, it kind of extends to what I was just asking you about. It was how would people from Senegal, from Mali, from Algeria, from these other places, how would they have viewed the whole Vichy France occupied zone? What did they think of in terms of their status? How was their status affected in 1940, and how was their status affected after Operation Torch when Vichy no longer exists? I mean, did those changes in status affect the colonies? I mean, they obviously did in a legal sense, but did that affect them?
Actually, I think, well, for the most part, and not in Algeria, which is a different stuff.
Yeah.
I'll come back to it in a minute. But for the most part, nothing changed, actually.
Yeah.
There were still the same masters. The flag was a bit different. Sometimes you had a new governor, but it was absolutely the same situation. In Northern Africa, it's different, and specifically in Algeria, because in October 1940, the Vichy regime acted a law against Jews. So an anti-Semitic law. Okay, so there was what we call the Jewish status, and so these people were considered at the time of second zone citizens, for instance, for at first, and second, they were in danger, of course, and so for them, Operation Torch was a big change, actually, because they were safe.
Yeah,
were not before that, and it should come as no surprise that lots of the Jewish communities in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco did, in fact, get volunteered for the French forces to fight in Italy and afterwards in France, because they have been actually, for them it was very critical and very different situation than it was for the rest of the colonies. But for the most part, it was nothing really changed. But you have to also understand that in 1944 there was the speech of Brazzaville from De Gaulle, who basically he said, well, it was cautious, something like France will not forget what the colonies have done for its liberation, and things will have to change. He was not promising independence whatsoever, but clearly, it was absolutely clear for everybody at the time that yes, things definitely had to change, and nothing would be the same, because all these people participated in the liberation of the French of the country, and they were obviously and naturally expecting something back, which is natural.
Mm. Mm. No, thanks for and Roman, one of my French friends here in Normandy, is saying, adding to the bit about some of the colonial troops fought the Free French, the Australians, the British, and the Americans under the Vichy regime, and then fought the Italians and Germans. Just again, we need a Netflix show. I mean, it is complicated, this, isn't it? You know, there is this.
Roman is absolutely right.
Loyalties change as the war goes on. I mean, the Italians weren't the only one to do that.
He's absolutely right. So sometimes you have people who fought so many different wars actually during the Second World War. It's incredible. Yeah, I think it's
the Finns, Poles, Lithuanians, Estonians. The list goes on of the people that were that their loyalties, their political, the Romanians, Hungarians. The list goes on. More questions we'll deal with, which are just going down to the details of this. Is what about the language? Obviously, the French is going to be the common language amongst these colonial forces, but how does it work beyond that? Because obviously you've got all these different languages, Senegalese, and how does it work in that sense?
So you are actually, it's a very, very interesting question, and I realized that I did not mention it. So the French army was actually using French, obviously, but for the colonial troops, it was a kind of actually very derogatory French way to speak to people. They were what we called le petit nègre, really small nigger. Okay,
yeah.
So very simple phrases. Usually just a word, a subject and a verb, and usually nothing more. And so it was a bit ridiculous.
It's like pidgin English that was used back in when the British were over in places like China and things back in the day. A very simplified version of English.
Yeah.
Kind of using local phrasing as well, but a simplified, childish.
Basically, it's a bit of a pidgin, right?
Whoops.
If you see how it works, and so it has been for lots of time. Also made for lots of jokes about the fact that these people were not talking proper French because they were not considered to be clever enough because of course, to be speaking proper French. When these people there to speak proper French, so people were mocking them because they were just like they were pretending to be white where they were clearly not. And so it was really a great and a big problem and a great issue, but mainly for the most part, French was used. But it was a very simplified version of French for many colonial troops. Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Another one we're dealing with is, well, Madcap made the point about, because you're talking about the relationship with the Americans, is that on the one hand, Roosevelt is pushing for decolonization after all. He's pushing the British to relinquish their empire. He's pushing the French to kind of or the Americans are, but at the same time, they're the ones with the segregated armies. So it's a complicated system, is that the America's kind of telling Britain and France how to manage their empires, but at the same time it's segregated. But that, like all these subjects, they are complicated. There's nuance. It's complicated. But a simpler one to answer, I hope, from Gaza is food and dietary requirements. How does that work? Because you've got Muslims there, you've got other people there with different requirements in terms of food. Did they just get standard kind of French army rations, or was there some system to accommodate the various dietary needs?
This is a very good question. I think there was I'm not too sure, but I think there was different meals actually, not halal or stuff like that. You could have meals without pork. You still actually, which is actually also the same inside the French army today. You have meals, you have rations, combat rations without pork inside the French army today. So I think it was the case, but I'm not too sure actually.
Okay. How beyond the official policies of segregation, because one of the things about the after Operation Dragoon, as they push up north and you get towards the Vosges and towards the Alps, I suppose, and the Americans are fighting alongside the French. They are in the same battles. They're in the same things. How did it get on the ground? You know, when French troops when American troops had to work alongside Black African troops who are part of the French forces. Was the cooperation okay on that kind of ground level?
I don't think actually. I don't think there was quite lots of mixing actually of troops, of French troops and American troops. So basically, they were doing the jobs apart from each other, and there was no real mix of the two troops. But the thing is, I've seen another guy ask another of your visitors and viewers ask a question about what was the relations between African Americans and the African troops. This, again, I'm not too sure. I'm not a specialist about this issue, but I think it might be very interesting actually to explore this. Still remembering that most of the African Americans in the U.S. Army were into logistics. So basically, they were in the rear echelons. So I guess there were occasionally meetings between these troops and their American and African Americans. I don't know exactly what happened, and if there is, I guess if it happened, and I can't see why, it might be very interesting actually testimonies, because it would have been very interesting and a bit puzzling, I guess, for all the African Americans to see all these Africans in U.S. uniforms fighting. And during the huge part of the fights for the French army, while they were considered not to be good enough to be soldiers and left to do logistics. So I think it's really interesting.
Okay, so I've got a question from Ian, but I'm changing the wording of it. When we're thinking of the French troops in Normandy, we think of the Croix de Lorraine. We think of the big, the one that, for example, on Juno Beach there, that's where Leclerc, de Gaulle came ashore. The troops fighting from the south of France, do they fight? Is the Croix de Lorraine anything to do with them? Do they fight for the French flag? Is there others? What kind of symbolism are they fighting under? Because as you said they're in a French army, but they're not French citizens. Do they have a kind of a banner of what they consider is their emblem?
Well,
obviously there's regimental insignia, but you know what I mean.
This is really interesting. For instance, if you look at the insignias, most of the Moroccan units have a star, which is the Sherifian star, which is the royal Moroccan star. Most of the units have this star, and usually you also have this on the emblems of the division. You usually have crescents. You usually have stars, just like you have in most states abiding to Islam, for instance, in Algeria or Tunisia, whatever. So you have lots of symbolism from their origins. And when you go into cemeteries, into French cemeteries from the Second World War, for instance, I've been to the one in Venafro around Casino. You have lots of tombs. You have a small mosque actually inside inside the cemetery, and you have Muslim tombs, you have Catholic, so to speak, with a cross tombs. You also have what we call animist tombs, so basically usually people coming from Africa with animist religion, so usually you have just a sun, just symbolizing every kind of other religions, not being Islam or for the people who are Muslims, Jews, or Catholic or Christian whatsoever. And so basically they were having a French flag. Some of them were having the French flag with the Croix de Lorraine, the Lorraine Cross, of course, because it was the Free French Forces. But lots of people, specifically the one coming from the Vichy army, were not really keen on waving a flag with the Croix, actually.
Okay, this is an interesting one, and it may more apply to not just the units in the south of France, but also like Leclerc's division. Kevin is asking, were there reprisals to your family if you join the Free French Forces? So if you're a wife and children and you're in Paris or you're somewhere in France, so metropolitan France, and the Germans find out that the husband has gone off to North Africa to fight with the British. I don't know how they would find that out necessarily, but were there reprisals? Would that be something that you could be punished for as a member of a family?
Well, Obviously, yes.
Obviously, yes, but
Obviously, yes, and this is why all these soldiers, actually, de Gaulle is almost the only one who actually took his actual name.
yeah,
Leclerc,
Leclerc's not even serving under his name, is he?
Leclerc, his name is Philippe d'Hautecloque, and they all took war names. Actually, most of the fighting French actually took war names, just specifically to not to have reprisals against their families. So yeah, usually
Because you know, if you again, if your wife in Paris and your husband is not in a prisoner of war camp in Germany and he's not doing service travail obligataire somewhere and he's not there in the house, he has to physically be somewhere unless he's been killed. So how do you explain the fact he's not there? You know, he can't just say he's gone shopping for the last 4 years. It's an interesting perspective that us Brits, who apart from the Channel Islands were never occupied, that fact that you can't just be a soldier, you're also worried about your family and the potential repercussions. Then the same applies if you're in the resistance in any of these countries. But yeah, it's
and the interesting part, for instance, is that when talking back about Beracam, when there were not that many actually, but many French prisoners when they left the camp of Beracam. And the German army announced that as the French has signed an armistice in 1940, they were not to be considered as regular soldiers, and so they would be considered as irregular, and so they would be. And so the General de Gaulle just mentioned that if the Germans were to do that, they were going to kill and shoot all their German prisoners, and it stopped there.
Wow. Wow. Next one, a really fascinating one. Susan, hello, Susan. Did people from the colonies have a chance to become French citizens? So during the process of serving or after war, or did it actually work against you? Because that's the thing that happened to people like the people from Czechoslovakia who fought with the Allies against the Third Reich. But then once their country becomes occupied by the Soviets, they then can get imprisoned for being, in a sense, anti-establishment. So if you move back to one of these territories, Senegal, Mali, wherever it would be, and after the war, did the fact you'd served in the French army help you or hinder you, or could it be either?
No, actually, there was no real. Well, they had a different status, so they were not considered as French citizens.
Yeah.
So some of them migrated in France and became French by migrating in France.
By migrating,
migrating in France, obviously, but not at all by staying in their own countries in Senegal and Mali or whatever. So no, these people were not considered as French citizens. Actually, they were members of the colonies, and as such, they remained with the status until the independence. Actually,
which is another massive great subject which we're not going to get into today. One that came in really early that I didn't ask at the time. Blaise was asking, question for the Major: were the Gumiers specifically trained in mountain warfare by the French army, or was the proficiency in mountain warfare due to the area they came from, namely the Atlas Range?
Both, actually.
Both. Okay.
So yes, they were coming from the Atlas. They were usually coming from very rural places in the Atlas, and they were also used for for fighting and moving in the mountains, and also for using mules. They were really which is a really useful animal in the mountains, for instance, of course, to get ammunitions, also to get evacuations of wounded soldiers and so on. And so, yes, of course, the French took the opportunity to use these specific troops to train them more adequately because it's not because you are used to the mountain and used to the cold and used to walk on crests and stuff like that and difficult passes in the mountains that you are a good soldiers in the mountains. So the French took of course a great care of using them and trained them specifically for mountain fighting. Yes.
Thank you. Another great question from Kevin. Did any French Africans rise high in rank in French colonial forces, or were they always led by white French officers? I hope I phrased this question correctly. So
you did, Kev. Well, obviously, all the officers, high rank superior officers, were white, no doubt. So there was, so you could end up being a captain, sometimes a major, but usually not better than that.
Mm. But some of these white officers, would they consider them, because they may not have grown up knowing France either, because they are from families that may have been living overseas in North Africa for generations, like you have with the British. Would they have seen themselves still as French first? They're white, they're French speaking, that have learned French at school and in their homes. Would they have thought of themselves as African, or French first and African, or both, or simply just French?
Well, it's difficult for the most of these. Well, for the officers that were born in metropolitan France, obviously they felt French,
Yeah.
no doubt. In Northern Africa, it's a bit of a different story, because they were already developing their own identity in Algeria, for instance, and also in Tunisia and Morocco. So perhaps they felt. They were French, but most of them, as I mentioned earlier, most of them actually had never seen actually France before landing in Provence. So they were French, but some of them and most of them were really thinking they were themselves as Tunisians, Moroccans, and Algerians of French origins, of course, speaking French, being proud of the flag, whatever. But still.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And then this is kind of the million-dollar question from Peter O'Connell. Sure, it will come up, but what were the Africans fighting for, and did their sacrifices do them any good? I mean, that's a massive, great conversation, isn't it? Because you say some were drafted, some volunteered. The Jews, for example, are fighting for a cause, and obviously independence did come for these colonies, some of them in the next 2 or 3 decades, but did many of them write their experiences down about how they felt and what they were fighting for? We've got some great accounts of people who served in the French resistance, in the Vercors, or in things like that, and French who served in the armor divisions. But do we really know what these individuals were fighting for, or was it too an abstract a question?
No, it's not an abstract question. There were lots of actually works from French historians that are know much better these subjects than I do. But if I'm trying to sum up what my readings on the matter, these people were fighting for the fatherland. It might well, whether they were drafted or they were volunteers, which were really rare, but they were considering themselves as fighting for the fatherland and for France. Were they retributed? Obviously, I think you might consider that their independence is somehow a kind of retribution for it. I don't think they were thanked enough for what they did at the time, during the period between the end of the Second World War and the independence, which is a problem in my view. Lots of these people considered themselves as veterans. The problems we have actually is many of these people didn't know how to write. So we are left with very few testimonies. This is one of the first problem. But I remember many years from now, a TV show where you had old tirailleurs Senegalais interviewed by the French television. And these people were absolutely incredible. They had, these massive amount of medals. They were wounded so many times. They had the Croix de Guerre, they had the Légion d'honneur, they had so many decorations, and they were talking about the sacrifices they did for the fatherland. And when they talked about the fatherland, they were talking about France.
Yeah,
and I remember I was a kid. I was like 15 or 16 years old when I saw this on TV. And I was like, it's such a disgrace. This is disgraceful. These people just basically gave, some of them gave their life. One of them gave his arm for liberating my country. They considered France as the fatherland, and France considered them at the time as members of the colonies and not proper citizens. It is a disgrace. You cannot. Well, it's history. Well, people. The joke about history. History is a different country. They don't think the way they don't act the way we do in this other country. So history is definitely a different country. So it's hard, of course, and it's of course sometimes it's easy to judge with our eyes of 2024 on the what happened 80 years ago. But I really think it's a disgrace, and it was plain for everybody to show that it was a disgrace. These people,
I mean, this is where, for me, this is the next big, in a sense, taboo subject to bring up. You know, in my time living in France, France is now very much dealing with its Vichy collaboration. I mean, you can switch on your TV, I can switch on mine. There'll be a documentary right now on Arte or something about Pétain, about that. Whereas that was kind of not ignored, but it was sort of, you didn't talk about it for several decades. But now that's fully in the open. But the treatment of the colonial troops and the resentment and the inherent racism, that is a subject that will have to be addressed, and of course it's going to connect.
It is already addressed. Claire Millot, for instance, has done an incredible job about the colonial troops. Pascal Blanchard, who is also a French historian, has done many books on this subject. So there are lots of books actually that has been written. I just have a few. Last book I just give me a minute. This is one of the last books I bought by Julie Dandurin, Les Troupes Coloniales, which is politics and military history, not just for the Second World War, but from the beginning of the colonial troops till now. And so it's a really interesting subject. And one of the funniest part actually is that in the French army today, you have what we call the troupes de marine, which are basically the French Marines. They were just like the British Marines. They were at first on boats, on ships from the Navy, and afterwards they were used in usually in the colonies and whatever. And so these troops were at the time called la coloniale or les coloniaux, and the nickname of the troupes de marine in France today is still la colo, for the colonial. Because they do have the traditions of the troupes coloniales. And for instance, you have a French brigade today, which is the 9th Marine Infantry Brigade, la 9e BIMA, Brigade d'Infanterie Marine, who has exactly the same insignias as the 9th DIC I mentioned, because it has a tradition of this unit. And so usually you have lots of C into the names of these regiments for colonial. So the C has disappeared and has been replaced by something else. But they still have the traditions of these colonial troops. And you have many, for instance, you have the 68th Regiment of Artillery in France, which is called, in fact, the 68th Regiment of Artillerie d'Afrique. And it still has a crescent and a star on his insignia to remember his North African origins.
Good. Well, I mean that's it's good to know that it is coming out there, and it is something that we will have to deal with lots of these issues of perceptions and racism and inequality. And I know that when I can sense that when I start talking about equality and things like that, there's people watching who'll get angry, and I'll get emails saying I've got Woody's gone all woke again and all that kind of stuff. But the point is, it is very important. It is important that we remember that World War II was all these peoples fighting together from different colors, from different faiths, from different political systems, fighting against a regime that was truly awful. Two truly awful regimes within the Axis, and we just need to just bring it all in the open again and understand that it took all sorts to defeat Hitler. And
if saying that is being woke, I am woke and you are woke too.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and I get these emails saying, why are you talking about Indian troops again? We want to hear about tanks and stuff. And the thing is, it just makes me want to do it more. It just makes me double down on it. They don't change my opinion, but anyway, we'll leave it there, Antoine. It's been great talking to you, and it's a fantastic subject to get into this subject of just how many French people fought down in that part of the world and how complicated it is series. So, folks, I'm back again a different time of day, earlier tomorrow afternoon. Brad Sanquois is joining me to talk about the Causeway charge in Walcheren as part of our Scheldt histories or series. So I'm looking forward to that. Keep watching, keep buying my guests' books, going to their websites, etc., etc., etc. Right now, this is Paul Woodhead for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye bye. Salut.